Good evening, everyone. I hope you had a good dinner. It was nice that you all helped with remodeling the space. It's quite fitting for the event of today as well, and the topic that we'll be talking about. Thanks for that. We're here tonight for Back to School with Paulien Bremmer. I don't know where Paulien is. She left. No. Oh. My name is Mike Emmerich, and I'm the director of the Independent School for the city. I will briefly explain you also a little bit about the school. But first, a short introduction on the Back to School With series. Back to School With is something that we started a couple of years ago, and it's a series of 3 lecture evenings in which we invite someone to curate that series. And we always ask someone that is in the process of doing research. So it's really like taking the audience along in an ongoing research project, this time on the other construction site. And we kind of give the opportunity to curate this series to also kind of create input on the lecture series or on the research. So with this lecture series, we collectively kind of try to bring it a step further. We've done so on a variety of topics. I'm not sure if it's readable, but this is, I think, the 7th edition. Well, and these were the ones that previously took place. For this series, we're now at the 1st evening, and then on the 4th of November, we're continuing with the 2nd evening, and the 18th of November, the 3rd one. Some of you have bought a ticket for the whole series. There's also separate tickets available for the 2nd and the 3rd one if you like it tonight. Paulien will explain more in detail about the program, so that will come later. This is the program for tonight. It's quite a packed program. We have a lot of speakers. But I think collectively it's going to be a really nice start of the series. I hope to wrap up around 12:15, more or less, and then I hope you all stay, or 9:15, sorry. And then with the drinks and 12:15, no. And then afterwards we open the bar and we hope you will stay around for a drink and some talks. Maybe for those of you who don't know the Independent School for the City, just a little context on where you are. So the Independent School, we always explain it as a school for people who already had an education, who already went to school. So focusing on professionals, and we organize a program that already since October 2018, so it's almost our anniversary. Which kind of is, you can divide it in more or less 2 parts. So we have, more school type of things that with smaller groups of people we focus on a certain topic in, for example, a week or a couple of weekends that we really dive into something. And we have a whole program which is a bit more public, which has different lectures, different discussions, symposia, and also this Back to School With series kind of fits in there. And the idea is that it's really like a conversation about the questions that are there in the city at the moment. And I think what is interesting to mention is that we as a school, we're not neutral. We do have quite a clear agenda of topics that we want to address, and we also have an opinion about them. And our program is kind of organized along 3 different lines. So on the one hand, the one of the Anthropocene, so the impact of mankind on the Earth systems, climate change, depletion of raw materials, etc., loss of biodiversity. There's a whole line of activities focused around migration and superdiversity. And then there's the right to the city, so more not only the affordability of the city, but also the kind of control that people have over their own living environment. And I think with this series, these 3 evenings, we will touch upon quite some topics that also fit in these three themes. I'm going to give the floor to Paulien, but not before introducing you. Because Paulien Bremmer is a cross-disciplinary architect based in Amsterdam. And with her work, she focuses on architecture and social and cultural practices. And we asked her to create this series, or it was more a conversation that we had, to curate this series because of her ongoing project, The Other Building Site, that is supported by the Creative Industry Fund within the call of Space for Justice. Well, Paulien will further introduce the evening, the series, and also the speakers of tonight. So I'm going to give the floor to you.
Okay. Thanks, Mike. Thanks. Hello, everybody. Should I hold this like this? Not that familiar. Okay. Okay. Hello, everybody. Very welcome. Super happy to be here with you all. I really looked forward to these evenings. Thank you so much, Mike, and the Independent School for the City for collaborating in this and hosting these events. Yeah, and inviting me. And thanks also Stimuleringsfonds for their support of this of the research. So I'm Paulien Bremmer. I'm an architect in Amsterdam, working under the name Studio Paulien Bremmer. And except for building, I also teach, make, and research, and these evenings are part of the latter. So this evening, this first evening in the series, The Other Building Site, is it started already off. Oh, sorry, this is the first evening. So it started already off with a lovely dinner, and in the meantime, there was a projection of Dries Verhoeven to perform. That I don't know, maybe you saw it. Part of Broeders Verheft U ter Vrijheid, which is a gigantic automated installation of a group of singing workers in an automated distribution center. And I think it is beautiful work which relates to tonight's program, but maybe you didn't all see it, so after the talk we will show it again. But it's, yeah, it's very nice as an intro, but also as an outro. So The Other Building Site is a research in other ways of building as an alternative to the existing extractive masculine system driven by time and money that we encounter on mainstream building sites. It's a research I initiated and it is basis for these 3 back-to-school evenings, and I'll tell you later a little bit more about it. The program of tonight consists of the whole series consists out of 3 evenings, and the first explores the conventional building sites with historical alternatives. The second evening explores contemporary alternative building sites, so alternatives up on the mainstream. And we invited for this Pauline Lefebvre of the University of Brussels, Swiss firm Ellipse Architectuur, also co-owner of a geo-based construction site, or geo-based construction cooperation. César Pere from Superuse on site, Jillekoop, Rijksvastgoedbedrijf and involved with the tender van Kantoor voor Afval, and Ninja Zuurheide, who experiments with products on site. The third evening explores more autonomous alternatives and will be about building worlds. We invited several building and living together collectives, and soon these will be published on the site of the school. So the evenings are structured in a kind of collage format, and tonight the conventional construction site, historic alternatives and women's building. And tonight also Sergio Ferro is main figure. Ferro is a Brazilian architect, artist and historian who criticized his whole life the production of architecture. He was active in Brazil in the 1960s, but spent most of his time working at the French architecture school in Grenoble. So Ferro looks at the architecture from below, which means he puts the building site and the building workers at the center of the architectural inquiry. He shows how disconnected we as architects are from the place where it all happens, the construction site, a place that for architects is increasingly fading from view. Especially now that with the alarming societal issues around climate, other forms of injustice, and the urgency for a new material culture, it was confronting to read his essays and conclude how naive we as architects sometimes are regarding our role within the system. Sergio Ferro demystifies the power dynamics through which we operate. Sometimes pretty harsh, but it is also open for beautiful alternatives. In the after talk, you could have bought these two beautiful books, but something didn't go. The distribution had a little mistake in bringing the books, but highly recommended. And the books, Katie and Mariana will tell later about it. So that's Sergio Ferro, but in the same time there have already been alternatives. For example, women's construction sites in the 80s in the Netherlands. It was astonishing for me to see how such an obvious alternative has fallen into oblivion, but also inspiring what possibilities these alternatives bring, optimistic and valuable places for practicing futures. For me, the other building site, this Back to School series, is about opening up and believing in the idea, joy, and the need for alternatives. And I'm happy that we are here to share and discuss these inspiring ones together. So the program of tonight, first me, I will tell about the research, the other building site, then Mariana Moura will follow. Mariana is assistant professor of architecture at the University of Antwerp. She was, amongst others, part of the Translating Ferro Transforming Knowledge project, researching and translating texts of Sergio Ferro, and the result is published in the two beautiful books which you just saw. Mariana knows Sergio Ferro and his work very well and will share this with us. She will also tell us about a little bit about her research on an interesting alternative, namely the women's builders in Brazil. And I'm very happy that Mariana is here tonight. After Mariana, time for some questions for me and Mariana, so maybe good to keep that in mind. And after the questions, I will talk briefly upon the work of my Bouwveld, followed up by a short interview which Alina, Paias and me did with Sergio Ferro. It's an interview of 10 minutes. And Alina is an architect, writer, researcher, and she was one of the curators of the Architecture Biennale in Rotterdam last year. And that's also how I met her. And I told Alina about my research, and Alina, as an expert on Sergio Ferro's work, pointed him out to me. So without Alina, this evening would have been very different. So thank you very much, Alina. Then after the break, Lloyd Thomas will speak. Katie's a visiting professor of theory and history of architecture at Newcastle University, and Katie was principal investigator for the Translating Ferro Transforming Knowledge project, which she worked on with Mariana. And in our research, the other building sites, so before, a part of it is about specifications and rules on the building site. The invisible written building site. Pretty nerdy. I was completely astonished that Katie had done a PhD on specifications. And then she relates also to the work of Ferro. I'm super happy Katie is here and gonna talk about this and what specifications really do in our capitalist system. And after Katie, Setareh will talk. Setareh Noorani is an architect, researcher and curator at the Nieuwe Instituut with a lot of knowledge about the archive, and Setareh was also involved in the research. We looked into the Vrouwen Bouwen Wonen archive, researching stories about women's building sites in the 80s in the Netherlands, and I'm super happy that Setareh will share this with us. After Setareh, time for some questions for her and for Katie, and then the bar will be open. So, I would like to start with the layout of the research, and which is still not finished, but it's the layout and how this research came into being. So the other building sites. So this is my website. I make a little, quite diverse, more or lesser autonomous work, varying from a shelf or exposition to the third building for the Gerrit Rietveld Art Academy. Its building site was the trigger for this research, and I'll explain. The commission for this building was special. It was given via a DIY competition. As a former student and teacher, I started a team with 2 students, an artist and people from my studio network, and we won and got a commission. Apart from designing the building, we were asked to develop the program and also the process, and that was a big opportunity to work with knowledge and craft of the rest of the artist community. So we formulated white spaces, so to name, and these were free spaces in the design which were developed by others from the community. For example, a student ceramics designed these tiles, which were executed by making use of the ovens of the department, or the floor and wooden furniture in the library designed by artist Niels Norman, and so on and so on. So the design process which we went through on the site itself, you see here our temporary workspace, was very open to the alternative. But with the contractor in the picture, joy and optimism somehow melted a little down. On the left you see, separated by a fence, again our shack, and right below, on the other side of the fence, the shack of the contractor. A telling image. I went to the site a few times a week, and not surprisingly, up in the shack as a woman in between 94% of men, I felt other. I had to make an effort to be heard, had to drink black coffee. The boots for visiting were a few sizes too big, same with the helmet, etc. I wondered whether this less welcoming culture was related to the fact that offices just run by women are still few. But then again, also men's architects feel awkward on the site. And apart from this, I had to understand that the interest of the contractor is time and money, and that all discussions can be traced back to this. But of course the question is this just, and how does this relate to other questions or to nowadays poly crisis? The Creatives Industry Fund issued the open call Space for Justice, and we decided to apply with the other building sites and got the approval. The project evolved in research in alternatives for the existing extractive masculine system driven by time and money. A research in 3 parts. Part 1. Research of a reading of the current conventional building sites. The site is surrounded by a huge fence, which is more or less transparent, but its purpose is to keep people away, to protect from theft, and to control the people working on the site. Workers, often from Eastern Europe with a favorable collective labor agreement, CAO, communicate nowadays via bouwspraak, building speech, especially developed body language, like put helmet on, drop down here, etc. Sanitary facilities are mainly equipped for cis men. And if you do a search with the words man tools, I got these images. And with the words woman tools, I got these. And I got a tip to visit some more obscure sites. I googled building site porn, and this was the first hit, a woman's architect surrounded by some enthusiastic men's constructions workers. Of course, the theme of the body also has a technical background. There's a limit on the lifting load of 23 kilograms determined by the NIOSH method. Starting point is that 99% of the cis men and 75% of the cis women can perform the tolling procedure, which means that 25% of the latter group cannot. At the same time, there are sufficient lifting aids that can easily eliminate these differences, but still women on building sites are scarce. The construction sector is one of the toughest professions in the Netherlands. 50% of the workers who retire are unfit for work. And also the most deadly sector. In 2022, 12 fatal accidents. The sector has an enormous economic power. It is responsible for 10% of the gross domestic product in the Netherlands. And these are the biggest Dutch construction companies, whereby half of these are listed on the stock exchange, driven by profit-seeking shareholders. So this was a fast scan of the building site, of which architects are educated that this is simply how it goes. I was struck by Sergio Ferro's essays, in which he writes so extensive about the system and also about the position of the architect in this. His essays like Design on the Building Site or Concrete as Weapon revolve around the theme of separation, about the historical separation between design and the building site, and the separation between execution and design. He shows how this separation extracts knowledge from the building site in favor of market profit. And Mariana will just after me tell more about it. Tina, or There is no alternative. The slogan of Margaret Thatcher, arguing that after the fall of the Berlin Wall, that the liberal capitalism is the only viable system. Philosopher Mark Fisher replied by writing Capitalist Realism. Is there no alternative? Going into the idea that it is easier to imagine the end of the world than the end of capitalism. Luckily, there are alternatives. You can classify them, or could classify them into genres. Historical ones, like the Gothic building sites, where Sergio Ferro refers often to. No separation, no architects, no drawings. Cathedrals were built in collectives by craftsmen who got the knowledge and tools to erect the building. Women's building sites, the Book of the City of Ladies by Christine de Pauzan in 1405, an allegorical building site for a city of ladies, whereby every building block represents a famous woman throughout history. Trümmerfrauen, German women after the Second World War who chipped off the stones for reuse. And in the meantime in England, Waterloo's Bridge needed to be finished. The work of the men who went to war is said to be largely completed by the women. The emancipatory building site. In the 80s, in the Netherlands, there were schools and building sites with a 3-year curriculum just for women, including daycare. Setareh will go into this. The building site of crafts. Studio Mumbai. In the heart of the studio, craftsmen are working in close collaboration with architects. The building site of experiment. Studio Luma in Arles, or with Assemble and BC Materials. Building just with bio-regional products, whereby the architect and the construction workers collaborate on the site, experimenting skill 1-to-1. The participative building site. The aim is in the USA, an altruistic, transparent process working and deciding in collaboration together, knowing how to repair the building later on. The building site of reuse, Brienenoord in Rotterdam by Superuse Studios. The uncertainty of the available materials ask for improvisation on the site with one-to-one tests and mock-ups. The building site of donation, precise and carefully taking apart the building to be donated to a building in process. Or the digital building site of prefabrication and assembly, but also of collaboration with robots and the disembodiment of the construction builders. The building site of repair, whereby listening to what is there, unpredictability to what you find, and small careful tools are key. Or the DIY building site of autonomy, often also related to counterculture, sometimes deployed as an activistic act. And the endless building site, the eco-cathedral of Leroy in Heerenveen, organized as a foundation called Stichting Tijd. The building site will be cancelled in the year 3000. Until that endless time, the site will continuously be maintained and transformed by growing plants and men pushing and rolling donated tiles and concrete leftovers on its temporary destination. 3. Measures, specifications, and speculation. How can you understand these alternatives? What is their mechanism? In collaboration with the National Real Estate Agency, Albert Janssen, the Association for Dutch Building Specificists, Wilma Visser, and Superuse Studios, Floris Schiefli, we try to understand these alternatives and developed a scheme of measures with which you might influence values on the building site. The measures are ordered on the left, thematically, like social, health. Not pretty readable, but social, but you have to believe me. So left, social, health, regenerative and financial, and the values on the scale, on the right side, like individual, group, or societal. Some of the measures are obvious, others are more speculative, but it is a never-ending list. It is more an attempt to gain insight into how to tweak the building site into a more just environment. But I think we better interpret it and see in the complexity the necessity of a more systemic change. Generally speaking, you see that with most of the alternatives, the organization of the building chain gets less divided, but instead more fluid. Collaborations amongst users, builders, commissioners, and architects are much more valued and shared. Hierarchy is tilted from vertical towards horizontal. It's not a construction site. It's not a construction site that just happened through, for example, a tender. It is a chosen building. It is a chosen building site. Classical power dynamics are broken going against the nowadays tendency to keep the architecture more and more away from the building site. On the alternative building site of reuse, for example, the role of the architect on the site is crucial. The state and amount of materials is unclear. Mock-ups need to be tested, solutions be improvised. And on a participatory construction site, users can join workers in the construction process. One advantage is that they can repair the building later on themselves, of course. If you take this hybridization of roles further, you can also see a hybridization of the state to consider the building in. With the increasing importance of circularity, reuse, transformation, repair, the idea of the delivery of the building gets diffuse. Time gets fluid. The building, or better said, the surrounding, is always in transformation. Maybe we have to speak of the built environment as a permanent building site, as a surrounding which can be appropriated, where we can add, transform, or top up the building, dissect, donate, rot, rebuild, compost, or grow the surrounding. Maintaining and repairing the more and more bio-based and circular surrounding, almost like gardening as an omni-human, living in slow transformation on a permanent building site, where building is living and living is building. Building worlds, not as a result of a drawing which seduces us with a flawless outcome, with the promise of an end result whereby you just have to accept that that the construction phase just asks for concessions. I guess Ferro would see this as principally wrong, maybe. So you cannot see the outcome separate from the process. The process is simply the outcome. And I would say, if there is an outcome at all.
We're now continuing with Marie. You've already been introduced, so I'm not going to say much. I'm just going to help you put on the presentation. And switch. There it is.
Hi everyone, good evening. I think I will still have to get used to the microphone as well. So I'd like to start, of course, thanking Paulien for having me here tonight. It's really great to be here and to talk about this, the work of Sérgio Ferro and the way that it intersects with my own. So Paulien has already introduced me. I'm a Brazilian scholar, but have been recently appointed assistant professor at the University of Antwerp. And I'm also one of the editors of the English editions of Sérgio Ferro's book, which were all translated as part of the TFTK project. So in which I used to work before as a postdoc researcher, also with Katie. So for me, it's quite special any time that I get to talk about the impact of Sérgio Ferro's work on my own research, and then of course any occasion that I have to meet with my colleagues again. So yes, just a very short introduction. TFTK is short for Translating Ferro, Transforming Knowledges of Architecture, Design and Labor for the New Field of Production Studies. Quite a big name. But it was a joint Brazil-UK project that was carried on between 2020 and 2024, with the main goal of course, introducing Ferro's work to an English-speaking audience, but also emphasizing the need to talk about themes surrounding architectural production, which include many of the topics that we are discussing here today, like the harsh conditions on the building sites and so on. So I have also divided my presentation in 3 acts, sort of representing encounters with different building sites and what they mean in terms of this reading of architecture from below. But I thought I'd start a bit with a prelude to my own encounter, to my personal encounter with Sérgio Ferro's writings, and I'm hoping that this will help me go full circle in introducing my research and my trajectory, and then how these two link together. So it started around 10 years ago when I was a PhD candidate at the Federal University of Minas Gerais, back in my hometown in Belo Horizonte in Brazil. And at the time, my research, my PhD, investigated different practices of urban commoning, trying to relate the experiences in the Brazilian context to those which had gained some prominence at the time with the Occupy movements and all the environmentalist causes since the 1990s. And as I studied some of these practices, and coming from some years already with experience of participatory processes and community-based works, I was really trying to articulate some sort of decolonial perspective to these commons, to the urban commons in a Brazilian context, but then also really looking at my own practice as a researcher and trying like that decolonial critique, harsh decolonial critique on my own work as an academic. So it was around that time, I think 2016 maybe, that I started, okay, instead of just like making questions and observing and interviewing these people involved in these urban commoning practices that I was interested in, I thought it was time that I started joining them. And then in 2017, we had this woman-only self-building workshop that was happening in one of the urban occupations. These are sort of informal settlements that have really started coming around again between 2000 and 2010s in Brazil, with very different scenarios from what everybody usually knows as like the favelas. But okay, this is a topic for a different talk. But then I got involved in this woman-only workshop, and we were learning to build with a woman master builder in a series of weekend multirões. And then, as these multirões, for me, like, okay, multirões are these sort of like task forces that are very common in Brazil, where people share a bit the responsibilities of the building process. And then for me, they were very representative of a practice of urban commoning, in the sense that building activities and all the resulting spatial arrangements were seen as a shared resources and also like as a shared effort between all of the involved. And it was not at all regulated by any kind of market interests, and then not dictated by any sort of up-down state public regulatory control, but was mostly self-governed within the community. So I was really interested in discussing those practices as this sort of urban commoning coming from the south, from the global south. But at the same time, I felt that a lot of the stuff that I was reading alongside that sort of contested these multirões as a valid alternative for the traditional building industry, and even and these critiques were coming even from like leftists and progressive scholars, and always with the argument that self-building ultimately contributes to capital accumulation. Because it takes away from market and from the state the obligation of actually providing housing, and then it accentuates the exploitation of the workers, which it does, because then workers have to cover themselves with the cost of the housing, which is part of the social reproduction of labor. And so in that sense, multirões were also were received very critically by part of the literature. And then so at one time I sort of agreed with that critique, but then it also bothered me that I felt this was a very economicist view on what multirões were actually about. And then at some point I started feeling a bit lost, like are these, like how to really navigate all of these things? Are they really, do they make sense? Should I really like continue this pathway or not? And then that's a bit around, that was a bit the moment where I sort of found Ferro's work for the first time. He was actually, I think he was already like actually like quite well known in Brazil. A lot of people have read him and know his work from a really long time. But for me, that encounter came in this contest. And then the first thing that I read of him was very focused on the theme of like self-building and self-organization between the builder workers. So on that specific theme, Ferro not only offered a sort of counter-argument to this direct relation between self-building and the increment of capital's accumulation, which I will also not explain here fully, but most importantly, I think he provided me that sort of dialectical reasoning that both acknowledged on one side the unjust inequalities and constraints of this building scenario, but then on the other really highlighted the importance of this self-determination in terms of collective projects towards emancipation. And so, yeah, in Sérgio's own words, Mutirões unavoidable or by political choice brought us closer to this idea of free labor and helped us imagine a different kind of architectural practice. So, but let me take another step back to sort of also explain a little bit how Sérgio had first started his own search for these kind of different practices. So what was his quest for a different architectural practice anchored on, and how his critique of architecture within political economy came into fruition. And that has a lot to do with the encounter with that traditional capitalist building sites. So, Ferro, this is Ferro. He was born in Curitiba, a city in south of Brazil, in 1938, and he proceeded to study architecture in the University of São Paulo in the late 1950s. During that time, Brazil sort of experienced what we refer to as the golden age. We had industrial development underway, and then all this leftist ideal permeating the country's cultural elite. And at that time, these dreams of progress and social justice really seemed attainable for Brazil, which is, I would say, it's quite rare to have that sort of collective belief that, okay, things are actually going to work out. And then for the architects, of course, those dreams were expressed very much on our visions for the future capital for Brasilia, which was, the plans were underway around the end of the 1940s and 1950s. And Sérgio was part of the generation who really believed that we could build a better country, and that we could start by building this ideal city that Brasilia was supposed to represent for all of us. And then Ferro's, his father was in the construction business, and because of that, he was commissioned projects in Brasilia quite young. He was still a student at the time he went to Brasilia for the first time, and he did that along with his lifelong friend, Rodrigo Lefebvre. And then what he encountered in Brasilia sort of really changed his architectural career thereof. Ferro is always very keen on explaining that their critique of the capitalist building site came not from a theoretical interest in the theme, like a prior theoretical or academic interest in the building site, but from the trauma of witnessing the terrible work conditions in Brasilia's building sites, and the realization that the city of progress and opportunities that was being idealized in the architect's drawing table and in his own drawing table were actually being built upon suffering and misery from a lot of the construction workers. So then, when he returns to São Paulo, Ferro joins the Communist Party, and then he really starts studying Marx, hence all these very Marxian terms around my talk. And but most of it was in order to make sense of what he had experienced and what he had witnessed in Brasilia. And I would say that his return, his encounter with Brasilia is also it's so, and starting to study Marx really marks the starting point of reflection for one of his most influential works, which is the Design in the Building Site, which was first published in Portuguese still in the 1970s. And then in Design and the Building Site, Ferro, what he's doing is he provides this sort of unique critique of architectural production under capitalism. And as Paulien already mentioned, he sort of situates design activities within a sort of construction industry that is run mostly by market interest. So, and what does that mean? And then, in a nutshell, I think what Ferro argues is that beyond any idealized plan of good intentions, and despite any ideological position that the architect assumes for himself and for his work, conventional architecture design is at the end like a work order that is meant to manage and control the labor on the building site just as much as you have workers controlled in a industry, in a factory. And that is also meant to keep the workers as divided and as subordinate to a work order as possible. And then that there is really like no amount of spatial intervention that can remedy that on its own. And then of course that by analyzing architecture as this sort of like really core activity for market profit, or like or for the accumulation of surplus value, like using his terms and with Marx's terms as well. Ferro is also trying to offer an explanation as to why a perceived backwardness of the building industry is not really the result of little technological investment, or it's not really the result of like lack of public policy on it, but it's mostly it's intentionally maintained so because construction industry depends on the extraction of surplus value that comes from its high labor content, which basically means that the building site relies on cheap labor of an extensive workforce to achieve the necessary or the desired profit, that rates of profit, and then which means also that to automate it would basically make it less profitable in a very very resumed, not dialectical, and not complete Marxian analysis at all. It's just like the gist of it, which of course making it less profitable will never really be the end goal of capital, for capital. And then if we take it one step further and we start thinking of it in a sort of globalized perspective, and if we follow the arguments of many Latin American scholars around the theory of dependency and the way in which these markets and this quest for profits are globally orchestrated, then the need for maximum profit also means that any level of building automatization somewhere is only possible because it relies in a level of strenuous, extractive, forceful labor elsewhere. And then for Ferro, I think this is also can explain why to this day we're still witnessing building sites that are as violent, as extractivist, and as deadly as those that Ferro experienced in Brasilia in the late 1950s. So that was the depressing part of the lecture. Because also for Ferro, approaching architecture as a process of production and not only as an aesthetic or a formal experience was also a way or a pathway to push for a critical reassessment of the architectural activity as well, and what was the architecture what was the architect doing in relation to the building site. So upon returning to Brasilia, and after graduating in '61, he started, along with Rodrigo Lefebvre and then also with Flávio Império. They were both colleagues in the School of Architecture in the 50s. They started this architectural collective group that was much later than the time that they actually worked together. They were then started referred to as Arquitetura Nova. But together, the group, they sort of experimented with a lot of different approaches to design process, all of them really grounded in the building sites and in these relations of labor in the building sites. They looked at different ways of organizing building activities more collectively, and ways that design would work in a way to allow greater autonomy for workers, and really trying at all of these experiments to bridge the divide between building and planning. So in Ferro's work, in Ferro's words, it was a work of thoroughly rethinking how to be an architect, instead of the usual way of starting from a desired result and then expecting someone to execute it no matter how. The path that they chose was to insert themselves on the building process and design towards a more open-ended goal, integrating know-how of all the involved parties. Many of these experiments involved construction of vaults, which this catenary vault like this, which sort of somehow became a sort of signature feature of their work. A lot of the houses they built in the 1960s were with this catenary vault. And a lot of the work that they did was actually commissioned by friends that were part of the leftist movement in general. So it was also like quite, you can say that it was quite reduced experience because they were working for private clients that gave them the freedom to experiment these things and the budget to experiment with these things. So all of this should be taken into consideration. But also, like, more than a formal choice, these vaults, for example, they really responded to an orientation towards economy of cost, of having exposed materials, which in turn were also exposing building processes, and really throughout always providing flexible spatial solutions, because you had a free floor plan inside, which then meant that workers' input could really be brought in. And the end result of these houses were also like filled with some unconventional solutions, which carried these traces of the labor of the construction instead of trying to hide them and instead of trying to mask them out, which for Ferro was really, and for all of them, was really important to sort of showcase the process of collective building. And then also, contrary to what might be assumed, their critique of this traditional design did not mean that Arquitetura Nova rejected the role of design or dispensed drawings, not at all. The group drew a lot. They drew profusely on the building site, but then they assumed the idea of a design of production instead of a design for production. So it was really processual drawings, and it was really on-site. And yeah. But then all of these experiments came into a very violent halt in 1964, when the military coup took over in Brazil. And at that point, the group was also already teaching at the Faculty of Architecture, and then they were really under surveillance a lot. And because of their involvement with the resistance, Ferro and Lefebvre were both arrested in 1970. And then when he was released, Ferro took exile in France, where he lives to today. And then living and teaching in Grenoble, he sort of like resumed his experiments in this more experimental building sites, but now mostly from a pedagogical perspective. And shortly after, he took a position at ENSAG and began teaching design. And then also, so with time, Sergio also started resuming his theoretical observations. He always also tells a bit this anecdote that he had this meeting with Rodrigo Lefebvre around in the beginning of the 70s, and they sort of decided that to continue their investigation together. Lefebvre, who was in Brazil, was going to carry on the more building site related, practice related, and then him being in France and not yet being able to practice architecture because he didn't have a proper license to work as an architect, he would carry on with a more historical process. And I think I really like this image, which is sort of the cover for the 3 books, because it's a detail from the central door of St. Peter Basilica. It's called Filaretes door. And it's a great depiction of the overall process that Ferro has been investigating all these years. That it shows the architect with a small compass in hand, followed by his craftsmen, and they're heading to the celebratory feast at the end of their work together. And this is actually said to be the first representation of an architect holding a small compass, and it's also quite an allegory that the compass facing the sky, like theory in opposition to practice, this architect becoming more and more distant from his former colleagues. So yes, the reasons behind this distancing movement and the various impacts that it had on construction are part of the reflections that are included in the in the Architecture from Below, which was actually the first book we published. It's a collection of essays that bring a lot of introductory, a lot of different essays. There's a variety of essays on different topics that Sergio has touched upon. I won't have time to go through many of those, of course, but there was one last of his writings that I would like to present and sort of like wrap up and return to my own work with women in self-building. And is a text that Paulina already mentioned before, Concrete as Weapon. So in this text, what Sergio is doing is examining the causes and the effects of concrete's emergency in Europe's 19th century building sites, but he does that by following the material shift and looking at how was the labor socially organized, and what was the work relations, and what were the situations among the construction workers that were going on at the time. So by placing this transformation in comparison, or by putting it through the perspective of the workers' organization in France, Ferro can also sort of claim and explain how the change of materials was not only an abstract and collective inclination to modernization or some sort of like zeitgeist of modernity, but also responded to the urgent needs of transferring knowledge and therefore transferring power away from the construction workers, away from masons, and away from carpenters, which were the main builders beforehand. And then, of course, wrapping up already, if we look a little bit at these material changes and then what they signify, we will also notice that this idea of knowledge monopoly and skill has also some gendered implications. So at the same time that the knowledge of construction with certain materials served as workers' weapons against capital, in the same way that concrete was used as a sort of weapon from capital in terms of the control over the building site and over the building activities. What my research has tried to argue throughout during my time at TFTK that started was also that same knowledge sort of also served as men's monopoly against women's inclusion on professional activities at the time. And this is an argument that was made by many different great feminist scholars, amongst them Christine Wall and Linda Clark, but then also Joan Kelly Gadol, with the idea that women did not have a renaissance. But so from the perspective of production of building sites of work activity, knowledge and skill were seen as these inherently masculine qualities, and so also served as weapons in these power dynamics between gender relations. And then, of course, gender was not really a concern of Sergio's work, but it was clear to me that looking historically at these social relations of production from the viewpoint of materials, I could try to make sense of all the things that I had previously experienced also in this working with women in different kinds of building sites. And I lost my last paper. It's a lot. So yeah, so by following the material like Ferro did, I noticed that before industrialized materials were employed, or better, whenever natural materials were being used, women's presence in building sites in Brazil were actually like quite common. And then that also like their knowledge and their autonomy in building was quite expressive. So my work has been ever since dedicated to sort of uncovering, registering and learning from these women, learning from women mostly in contexts of self-building, and understanding the context in which they learn how to build and the reasons why they stop to do it. In a way, I'm trying to like follow Sergio's step and build a history of architecture from the self-building side. And this is a history where where we might acknowledge women's historical presence and the many contributions that they have actually made for the built environment. And I think it can be defined as a sort of feminist reading of construction site, whereby I try to really shed light at these overlooked aspects and the dynamics of power and knowledge and skill, and how do they play out in different contexts as well, and not only in this very market-oriented perspective. So yes, for the past 3 years, I've been collecting stories of women engaged in self-built architectures. I've been learning with them. I've been building with them, talking with them, registering their know-how. Yes, I'm hoping with what will at some point become a sort of oral history repository that everybody can also look at and learn from and experience. And then, in a sense, I think that Ferro's work remains, to me, a great inspiration for the sheer fact that it opened a new world of possibilities with looking at history from a completely different perspective, and then showed me that following certain neglected small traces can lead to the unfolding of a completely different history. Thank you.
Just stick around for it. And Paulien, can you also join? Oh.
You only have one working?
No, I think the other one should also be working. Maybe time for 1 or 2 questions from the audience, either to Paulien or to Mari, or any remarks, any responses.
Hi, thank you both for the great presentations. I have a question, Paulien, to you. I worked on a topic of construction sites and migrant workers, but in the UK and Germany, and often they also inhabited the construction sites. And I was wondering if you know if something like this is happening here, because this was something I thought, I mean, that's a bit bold to tell this to you, but I would add one more slide as a construction site as a dwelling, actually, because in those places, especially I think in like a smaller scale construction sites, it's very common that the workers live there. Yeah, I was wondering if you know something about this situation here.
Well, actually, I don't know an example like on top of, but I assume, especially when you hear also other stories in other disciplines at the moment in the Netherlands. I guess so. Yeah, and I think it's very common all over the world. Or very common, maybe not, but it is. Of course, it happens. I guess. Yeah. I don't know. Yeah.
Yes.
This is a question for both of you, actually. I'm really curious how maybe you have witnessed and you imagine the social dynamics on the construction site, the ones that you were working with. What is the sort of imagined or witnessed difference in the social dynamics or the social infrastructure on the construction site beyond the one that you mentioned, Paulien? You know, like you mentioned, there was hierarchies, there were particular rituals that happened, the drinking of the coffee, these sorts of things, but also the idea of the work order, like what would possibly change, or what has changed in that social infrastructure, in the other building site, or in the building sites that you witnessed working with women. I'm just curious what you saw or.
Do you want to go first?
It's okay, no.
So I would say that for self-building, and especially for this context where these are mostly constructions that are happening in rural areas, so very different access to industrialized materials, very different overall dynamics of living in general. I think that I could say that there is a difference. There is a division of there is a sort of gender division of tasks. Men are more responsible for one part, women more responsible for the other. But what I notice in general is that they are not linked to any sort of hierarchy. Like, it doesn't make a difference if you are the person, which would be quite the opposite from a traditional building site. So if you are the person designing, then you have one level of authority. And if you are the person that is, if you are the, I don't know, the person that is doing the structure, you have another level of authority. And then Ferro also explains this a lot in designing the building site, how like the lowest part of the building is, of course, the carrying of materials, which then is interesting because a lot of times in traditional building sites, this is where, if women are involved, then this is where they would be in this sort of like de-skilled tasks. But this division, this hierarchy between who is doing what and what's relevant and what's not, is not as blatant, it's not as clear in the self-building sites, but that changes a lot also if you're in the city. So then what I always try to do is sort of have these three intersectional analysis that considers industrialization, urbanization, and modernization, and then see how these three interfere in how the social relations in the self-building site change as well from one place to the other.
Anything to add?
I think it is quite. It goes probably a little bit in the same direction. Also, I think you mean on the alternative building sites, right? Yeah. I think also, like I said, in general, hierarchies are much more horizontal and much more collaboration. I think also much more joy. People like it much more to work together and work in these kind of places. I think that in that way it's a better, nicer culture. Yeah, livable. Yeah.
Well, thank you so much, Marie. I would suggest we just move on to the next part, and there's some time for questions all the way at the end of the evening.
On the bar, we can talk.
And on at the bar as well, for sure. Until 12 to 15. Yeah. Yeah, floor is yours again.
Thanks. Okay, the next is my Bouwveld. I want to show you something of her. Oops. Yeah. So yes, there are also other ways to look at the mainstream building site, of course. My Bouwveld graduated from the Gerrit Rietveld Academy of Fine Arts in 23, and she now works as a graphic designer in Tallinn, Estonia, where she grew up. This is something from her a text from her thesis. So, looking from afar, I can't tell excavators are led by another. In a way, we appear so similar that I cannot believe that they are not alive. Bones connected by joints, tendons contracting and releasing, water running through our pipes, each of us with our own mouth saying a different thing. So my project consists of a thesis, a ceramic clay excavator, and clay prints she transferred from the building site. Her thesis, and again her thesis. And in her thesis, she describes living next to a construction site. She's fascinated by excavators, captivated by the sound they make, the rhythm, the power. She felt the urge to physically relate to the excavator. She considered the excavators as being practically alive. Such a more animistic perspective is not foreign to her. She describes it as a way of seeing that wasn't common in ancient Estonia. Estonians connected with their environment by personifying nature and objects, like a forest had a spirit, a cave is sacred. Her fascination with these creatures, the excavators on the construction site, becomes obsessive, and she decides to cross the construction site's fence. At night, she scans the excavators with her hand scanner, and she records them, so to speak, in the scanner. She also makes prints. She presses clay onto the machines and thus collects parts in negative. I find it fascinating how May wants to connect so deeply with the excavator in sound, in image, but also with her body. A kind of childish fascination with the building site, but also I think her project beautifully thematizes the body itself. Her own body, the machine's body, the worker's body, the impact of the body. May's thesis contains also this uncanny valley diagram developed in 1970 by the robotics professor Masahiro Mori. It measures an object's degree of resemblance to a human being and the emotional response or empathy for the object. In the left corner of the diagram, the industrial robots, provoking little familiarity. And on the right side of the scheme is a healthy person, the most relatable one. The bodies of corpses, prosthetics hands, and zombies are sitting in the deep valley, causing negative emotional response. This is a robotized excavator of Graphis Robotics. Graphis is a startup, a spin-off of the Robotic Systems Lab of ETH Zurich, one of the most advanced worldwide in automation. The aim of Graphis is to turn generic heavy construction machines into massive robotic manipulators. They add retrofit hardware kits on standard excavators. Sensors, computing and communication capabilities command the machine and let it function autonomous. Oops. The machine determines itself how to stack different complex stones in the most optimal, efficient way. Natural stone, but also stones from demolished buildings. And this is how Graphis Robotics presents itself, as working from the realization that we do not want to deplete Earth, but want to make optimal use of the material. So how to relate to those machines, to these mechanized construction sites? Relationable in kinship, or more technical as a solution, as a replacement of our body? Is automation a promise for the unhealthy, dirty building site? Alina and me talked with Sergio Ferro about it and about a little bit more.
Hoje em dia, todo mundo sabe, quem manda no mundo é o capital financeiro. Mas o capital financeiro não vive sozinho, ele precisa absolutamente do capital produtivo. Quem fala em produção hoje, fala em produção industrial. Está na boca de tudo quanto é presidente, rei. Nós precisamos criar trabalho, nós precisamos industrializar países ou redesenvolver a indústria, etc. Ora, isso é um absurdo lógico, porque a vocação da indústria é exatamente eliminar o trabalho humano. O ideal é a automação total. O ideal da indústria é a automação total. Sobram os trabalhadores que fiscalizam as máquinas trabalhando sozinhas. A taxa de lucro industrial diminui constantemente. A cada vez que o capital industrial precisa comprar novas máquinas, elas são mais caras e mais produtivas. Então, precisa de menos trabalhadores, mas precisa de muito mais capital constante, maquinário, insumos, etc. Algum lugar tem que produzir mais valor, tem que produzir valor para que não aconteça um desastre total e o mundo vá à falência por causa disso, né? Não, ninguém mais produz valor, se tudo for industrializado. Eu acho que essa robotização, esse avanço tecnológico é maravilhoso numa outra sociedade, não na nossa. No fim do terceiro volume do Capital, é um capital fundamental para todos os leitores, arquitetos da construção lerem, é o capítulo sobre a queda tendencial da taxa de lucro. Todo esse blá 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 é para dizer uma coisa muito simples. A construção e a arquitetura não têm nenhuma autonomia hoje em dia. Elas são pressionadas por esse mecanismo. Então, é muito difícil pensar em alternativas dentro do campo tradicional do métier. Um arquiteto brasileiro chamado Lelé Filgueiras, não sei, que fez um trabalho maravilhoso com pré-fabricados. O problema da pré-fabricação é sempre o que a gente está dividindo o corpo operário em dois pedaços, né? E o Lelé tinha o cuidado de sempre alternar as equipes, de tal modo a não dividir o corpo trabalhador, não reduzir, não mutilar o corpo trabalhador. Um dos problemas mais graves do nosso desenho é que nós dividimos os métiers dos trabalhadores em pedacinhos, micro-operações. Até o fim do século XIX, os operários tinham controle do saber fazer construtivo. Eles que tinham, né? Essas relações violentas de um canteiro novo devem desaparecer, porque, de uma certa maneira, a gente vai ter que voltar a construir e ir mudando as coisas durante o processo produtivo, porque na reconstrução. Então, necessariamente, vai haver uma aproximação maior do corpo produtivo e do arquiteto, né? E eu sei que é muito difícil a minha crítica, a crítica que eu faço, a situação atual dos canteiros de obras. Mas eu sempre termino com uma proposta de alternativa. Então, são dois tempos. Primeiro, eu descrevo o horror, que é o canteiro de obras hoje, e segundo, as perspectivas, as possibilidades, e também quero contar experiências reais, por exemplo, dos trabalhadores sem terra no Brasil. Isso porque eu acredito que a gente precisa, sobretudo, terminar com o nosso isolamento, nossa separação do resto do canteiro. No Brasil, os componentes do movimento dos trabalhadores sem terra é gente muito humilde, que não tem nada, nada, nada sério. Muitas deles dormiam na rua. No Brasil, a Constituição dá direito de desapropriar terrenos que não sejam produtivos nem utilizados para dar a essa gente, quando eles estão organizados. Isso foi a Constituição depois da ditadura. E, inclusive, ocupar prédios vazios que estão lá no meio da cidade. Esses grupos no campo já são 3 milhões de pessoas, 3 milhões de pessoas, crianças e adultos, porque a gente escreve, são escritos famílias. Quando eles conseguem um terreno, eles começam plantando para comer. Nós estamos trabalhando agora, eu estou trabalhando junto com eles, para que a gente possa conseguir a mesma coisa em construção. Porque o segundo produto de maior necessidade é a casa, a proteção. A gente está tentando utilizar materiais reutilizáveis ou materiais naturais. Trabalhando com terra, com madeira. Eles já têm contato e participação do maior laboratório europeu e mundial de construção em terra, que é situado em Grenoble. Essa instituição em Grenoble já enviou para trabalhar com eles quase 20 técnicos de alto nível para examinar a questão da construção em terra, a tecnologia da terra, como fazer, etc. E eles também plantam árvores que poderão servir para a construção. Então, há esperança, há um outro mundo já nascendo. Quando é na cidade, a gente ocupam prédios prontos, a reciclagem, a restauração daquilo lá é uma missão nossa, dos arquitetos, dos construtores, de todo mundo. Eles fazem um tipo de trabalho solidário que é lindo. Tão solidária, que a gente não pode imaginar a transformação das pessoas junto com a transformação do trabalho. Exatamente. Exactly. O capital acabou com tudo. É a primeira das artes, não tem nada que se compare, só a cozinha. Yes, yes. A prova são os trabalhadores sem terra. A gente tem que, talvez, sair um pouco do birô e fazer movimento social, e protesto, e ir para a rua também.
Okay, we would like to continue. So Katie will now continue with the beautiful story about specificists or specifications.
Okay.
Thanks.
I need this. Thank you and hello. And I know you've had already a very packed hour, more than an hour. So I'll be kind of cutting a few bits out. But yes, I've been having some great conversations with Paulien over the last few months. And she's asked me especially to talk about my work on specifications, but also to tuck in something about Stock Orchard Street House for you as well. So I'm going to try and do all of that. And I suppose one thing I do want to say about the architectural specification, you've already heard quite a bit about Sergio Ferro, is just that although Ferro does talk about specifications from time to time, he tends to spend much more time speaking about the drawing, the architectural drawing. He refers to them sometimes. We use the term prescriptions for these other kind of sort of documents that get produced by architects and others in the office. And the talk's in 3 parts. In the interest of time, I'll just tell you that it's sort of, I'll start by talking about specifications. In particular, these 2 specifications from the 18th century that mark a kind of a big change and shift in the way the document's organized. And then I'm going to talk about, I suppose, a more alternative building site and what happens when you build with materials, experimental materials, what happens then to the specification. So back in the 2000s, my PhD research, which is now the book you can see on the very left, the building materials, was about the almost philosophical problem of how language can capture materiality as something which is almost beyond words because it's a kind of bodily experience or experience bodily. Though I started this project from poetry, fine art, and psychoanalysis, at some point I remembered the specifications that I used to write as a year-out student in the architect's office, and that they too described building materials, but, and this was the important thing, in a variety of different ways. In those pre-digital days, we used the NBS, or the National Building Specification in the UK, and we used to copy clauses from the kind of master document of sort of options to create our own specifications. And effectively, there were kind of, let's say, three types of specification that I remembered from those days. The first is the most simple. It's just we would name the materials that we want to use, and you see this, we'll return to this. This is in an 18th specification where you just get, 18th century specification, just get oak or deal or fir, the basic names of the timbers to be used. Then there was another, maybe more interesting kind of description, and that I now call the process-based specification, but perhaps we could think of it a bit like a recipe. That's when you explain the material by how it's going to be worked up or made on site. So you actually give the processes of building in the description. And finally, much more dominant today and very familiar to all of you who are practicing architects, I expect, is performance specification. Interesting again, because it neither names the material, in fact it must not, and it doesn't give the processes of working. It describes materials and systems through how they are going to behave in the finished building, so through a set of performance criteria. So radically different. Were these different concepts of materials, I wondered? Where did they come from? How could these contradictory forms of description sit side by side in one document? So I began to research the history of the specification and these changing forms of description. I gradually realized that the variety of language of specification had little to do with architects' ideas or preferences. Rather, the forms of description followed and were also instrumental in much wider changes in the building industry, such as how building work is organized on site or how materials are manufactured. But it would be the work of Sergio Ferro that would help me understand some of these changes. And here I just need to thank everyone that worked on the project, TFTK, and the amazing work that Mari and the translations team did that mean that we now have these, well, 2 at the moment, a 3rd one will come out next year, these volumes of Ferro's work in English. That made my life a lot easier for sure. I'm going to, so to show you, to give you some sense of how Ferro's ideas could explain some of the changes in the forms of specification, I want to look in some detail at these 2 very different specifications. And what's extraordinary really is they're 35 years apart. So the one on the left from 1734, it's from a townhouse in London. And it's written on parchment, handwritten by a scribe. And the one on the right is a printed document. In fact, it's a series of pamphlets. So very, very different. We'll come back to them in a moment. So we've heard quite a lot already about Sergio's ideas. But it's useful then to remember, no, actually I'm just going to go back here. So, writing in the major work, Design and the Building Site, Pharaoh explains that specifications, like plans and drawings, are in fact work orders that command divided labour. And just to go into a bit more detail about what he means by this, I think we've heard already quite a lot about this. So he takes us back to the medieval cathedral building site and points out that their building took place in the form of simple cooperation without an architect. The artisan builders, he writes, all knew the rules of their craft, the secrets to building a cathedral. And of course, they would often draw one-to-one designs direct onto the cathedral floors and walls. And Pharaoh takes then as this symbol, in opposition to the handheld compass that Mari showed us in the frieze, the large divider which can trace out geometries on the ground. And gradually, as we've heard, through the Gothic period, the practice of design starts to develop, by which Pharaoh means separated design. At first it's carried on site, but in a separate space, so say in the tracing room of a cathedral building site, and later at another place, at a distance, the design studio. Drawings instructed the process, taking decision-making away from constructors and overriding their know-how and expertise. So the symbol becomes the handheld compass. And Pharaoh asks us to see these in buildings, so the kind of facade of the Chartres Cathedral, when there is still this kind of, the architect really isn't around, is kind of following the logic of the tools and the work that masons are doing. Whereas at Strasbourg Cathedral, we saw the drawings earlier in Mari's presentation, it's as if the construction is now following the logic of the drawing. So, and we've also heard quite a lot about why this matters. It is know-how, Pharaoh believes, following Marx, and cooperation that give building workers their bargaining power against the exploitation of their labour, not to mention pleasure and creativity in their work. The use of the drawing, separated design, the emergence of the architect are tools in the dismantling of this power. So back to our specifications. This one is for the house in St James's Square. It's the oldest specification that I've held in my hands, and it takes the form of a medieval contract. So it was written out in duplicate twice and signed when it was one single piece of parchment, and after the signing the wavy line would be cut, so there was a kind of material evidence of the fact that this signing took place. And it's clear when we look at it, it was never really meant to be read. It was a kind of a legal version of the building in words. And it's also interesting to look at the way that the document was organized. So a bit like a section, it just takes the building floor by floor. In this particular case, it's the ground floor first, working its way up. And mostly what it provides are the dimensions of the rooms and some of the key structural beams. And we've seen also it might name some of the important materials. But this document, just 35 years later, this is for a large public building, a jail and sessions house, also in London, is organized in a completely different way. This is, again, it's a lovely document to see. One of the versions that they hold in the archive has these 8 leaflets or pamphlets, one for each trade that was involved, the plumber, the plasterer, the carpenter, and so on. So we're already seeing the new organisation of the building industry that would eventually become general contracting, so the primary sort of way of organising building on site in the late 18th and 19th century. And this is where, instead of having the master carpenter organising work on site, as we saw with the St James Square, you would have a general contractor subcontracting out to the different trades. Obviously needs to make some money in that process, needs to make sure that they're getting more for the project than they're paying out to the trades. So there's both an issue with kind of quality, how to maintain quality control, and this type of specification is usually talked about giving more detail, more quality, sort of quality control. But if we think of it in terms of Ferro and Marx and the division of labour, we can also see that this kind of parcellation of work is also happening through the document. So the sort of reduction of cooperation between trades and a kind of overriding sort of system that totalises the building work rather than that happening on the site through the people who are building. Okay. And in fact, this kind of increasing division of trades is very, very visible. This is late in the 19th century. This is a manual for how to write a specification. And in this, we have more than 40 trades now mentioned in how you would structure the specification. And the other thing which is important to note in this specification is the introduction of process-based clauses. So we start to get these very detailed descriptions appearing of the work that's been done. So in Britain, this practice continues for the next 200 years. We see it in the description of mortars. This is very kind of common, very detailed through the 19th century. I especially love the fact that they tell you where to get your sand from a particular stretch of the River Thames in this one. But concrete specifications throughout the 20th century have an even greater level of detail. This is one of the earliest reinforced concrete houses in Britain with enormous amounts of work, and right up to the sort of 60s and also the specifications that I was writing in the 80s. But here we see this, I mean, it starts to get ridiculous. I mean, this is at a level of a kind of novel talking about building the concrete roof of this. It's only literally the concrete roof of this building. And I think it's about 18 pages. So, what does the writing down of the how by the architect achieve when it appears in a specification? Supposedly, it sets standards for the quality of the work. But actually, if we're thinking about Ferro, it's transferring the decision of how to build something away from the building worker to the designer, and it's facilitating, therefore, the de-skilling of the builder. And that, as we started to hear, is one of the ways that capital devalues workers' labour, so it can extract more surplus. The trades-based specification is a distinctive form of the comprehensive prescriptions that Ferro sees as enabling the exploitation of building workers in the service of capital. And this is the final section, and it's really nice actually to talk about this example of Stock Orchard Street House. I know that there are people here that work with reused materials and so on, and it would be lovely to hear in the chat afterwards if there are sort of examples from your own practice that this might relate to. Today, at least in the UK, the process-based clause has all but disappeared from the specification now that performance specification has become dominant. By defining only the criteria that building components need to meet, decisions about how to most efficiently meet those criteria are returned back to contractors. So this is a total turnaround from the trades-based specification that aimed to describe building work in detail. I got very interested when I was doing the specifications research in what happens when architects seek to work with reused and experimental materials, when behaviors can't be quantified and tested, which is what the performance regime demands. So I talked to some architects about how they specified their projects and tended to find, interestingly, that they often dispensed with specifications altogether. Often, in fact, working more directly with builders, more like the systems of trust and shared expertise that there were in the 18th century before general contracting. And really, I'm giving the example of the Stock Orchard Street house more than anything because it's the one that I know the most about. That's why I'm always interested to hear other examples. So you may know the Stock Orchard Street house. It's better known as the Straw Bale House, designed by Sarah Wigglesworth Architects. What fascinated me at the start was its use of excessive materials and the gender critique that Wigglesworth explained them with. When I asked to see the job files, hoping to find specifications and curious how these non-standard materials would be described in them, I discovered there weren't actually any specifications. Instead, there were these incredibly meticulous drawings, as you see on the end, pencil drawings, in fact, of how it should be built. And Wigglesworth told me that the builders often didn't follow them at all. So, the house, if you don't know it, is organised around a play between the professional world of the architect's office and the domestic realm of the home, as usually associated with women. So we're back in an interesting way to gender. So it kind of hinges around the sort of like the sort of meeting room, and this harks back to when you've got your office and you use the kitchen table both to work on it and to meet clients, but also to have your breakfast. So that kind of is the hinge between the home and the office. And then there's a kind of reversing. The office takes the form of a sort of terraced house, whereas the house, part of the project, takes the form of a sort of office building and uses curtain walling, steel and glass construction. Wigglesworth was interested also in a kind of critique. She thinks of it as a gender critique around materials. She wanted to critique and confront the conventions of modernist architecture, preferring hairy materials to slick materials, celebrating amateur processes of making rather than precision manufacturing, and also taking an interest in the kinds of ways of making perhaps that belong more to women's work or to the work or to the interior. So for example, the office part of the building is clad in this kind of soft upholstery, which needs something that looks rather more like a sewing pattern in order to be made. The builders apparently called this the nappy. And there was a functional reason for using this kind of upholstery, in that the house is on a major train line out of London. And the other material that's very interesting that they used were these sandbags, which they filled with cement. The sandbag would then decay, and it was just left with this sort of cement block to dull the vibration and noise of the trains. And again, the drawings for these are interesting. They have to sort of develop a way of producing the wall. But what's really interesting here is that the builders don't actually follow the drawing. So for this kind of rig for just filling the bags with cement. They designed this enormous thing. You can see the person in it there. So it's kind of way over human size. And in fact, the builders developed something much more kind of nifty and practical, but started then to draw on their own expertise and their own imaginations and solutions in the building. So in the case of the Stock Orchard Street house, the changed social relations on site were not the objective. They were a side effect of this interest in alternative materials. And in fact, later, I found out that the contractor, Martin Hughes, had previously been a key player in the technical aid movement of the 1980s, which obviously tried to change relations, the sort of role of architects would have more as an enabler for clients than a designer, but also in Britain was rethinking relationships between builders and architects too. They were often joint collaborations. And I'm delighted to say that when the book about Stock Orchard Street came out, Wigglesworth did give a chapter to Martin Hughes to talk about the project as well. And he also recalls many of these kind of processes where there was a lot of invention from the building team. But I use Stock Orchard Street here really as a prompt for thinking about the building process and relations on something on site as something we can design or at least consider in our design approach, as we saw earlier in Pauline's scheme for the Art Academy building. I've argued here that drawing on Sergio Ferro's work, that specifications like drawings are one of the tools which organise work on the building site on behalf of the extraction of profit by the building industry. Although we're unlikely ever to be able to build outside capitalist systems, recognising and understanding the role drawings and specifications necessarily take in instructing building work would allow us at least to begin to use them creatively and critically. And I'm just going to finish with a very favourite example. This is a specification written by the Swedish architect and teacher Brady Burrows. She proposes in her book, Architectural Flirtations, the kind of queer rebuilding of one of the terrace houses in this kind of row by the famous Italian architect Aldo Rossi. So it's a kind of amazing queer conversion of this building. And very delightfully, she uses the specification as a means to kind of develop a sort of a queer architecture. And I've blown it up on the screen so I can read it, but you're getting it bigger as well. I'll just finish with a couple of clauses from her invented specification. Here you go. All materials as originally specified in this document, where the construction document does not indicate or similar, unless you have a better idea, ask. And then maybe a couple of favourites here. Where possible, small local businesses, especially those owned by women and or minoritarian subjects, should be given priority for contract of services. And finally, there is no minimum level for the skill of craftspersonship, as everything is to be done with enthusiasm, care, and a love ethic. Okay, thank you.
Thank you so much. I would suggest we directly go to Setareh Noorani's presentation, and then we have some room for questions to all of the speakers. There you are.
Yes. Thank you so much. Thank you, Pauline, for indeed inviting me. And thank you to all the other speakers. It was amazing. Katie, great. So I actually also want to say, in the interest of time, I will try and speed this up a bit. I am going to give a couple examples, so I might need to cut one or two. But if you see an image and you have some questions about it, also feel free to ask it afterwards. From the early 1980s to the 1990s, a range of self-built initiatives originated from a network of women called Vrouwen bouwen wonen, translated Women Building Living. This open collective of architects, planners, designers, urbanists, policymakers, historians, and so much more, founded in 1983, decided on research and a range of experiments for better housing and living for women. The origin of this focus lies with a group of feminists in the 1970s who organized under the name Vrouwen bouwen, Women Build. Initially, they aimed to acquire an old brick factory, to initiate a women's self-built experiment. To quote, "To plan nothing beforehand, to build in the form that feels right, using local materials, easily manageable without reliance on complicated or expensive systems." Their goal was to explore what forms of housing and building women themselves would develop. Around this idea, the network eventually established the foundation, Stichting Vrouwen Bouwen en Wonen in 1987, operating from the Bouwcentrum Om de Wena in Rotterdam. Throughout its years of existence, the interests and working terrains of Vrouwen Bouwen Wonen members extended across multiple design and planning scales, from urban and neighborhood planning to housing design and alternative forms of living. Notable projects include the Burgerziekenhuis voor Vrouwen, which I recommended just now to my next door, to my neighbor there, and the Staatsliedenbuurt in Amsterdam, a neighborhood designed for urban renewal. There, social workers, opbouwwerkers, organized a course that taught women how to participate in the conceptual phase of the design process, how to ask the right questions to architects and counselors, and even how to create design proposals themselves. This presentation, however, will focus on the scale of the women's building site as an ecosystem for practicing radical futures, where alternative economies and material ecologies were practiced. Through building experiments and specific self-initiated commissions, members consider the construction site as a testing ground, as a space to practice the future. And we can distinguish 3 practices of the women's building site, specific to Vrouwen Bouwen Wonen, throughout their work. The first practice is fueled by an ecofeminist perspective, angling itself towards the environment and sustainable material cultures. Second is a feminist socialist perspective, emphasizing the repositioning of women's labor and the importance of emancipation through work. And lastly, there's an anarchist feminist thread, which manifests itself through questioning of all hierarchies, in favor of free association and cooperative networks that sustain through mutual aid. Using Sarah Ahmed's concept of the feminist toolkit, this presentation proposes that the members of Vrouwen Bouwen Wonen use their toolkit to deposit those things that are necessary for survival in the built environment. Personal and collective agency were linked in pursuit of more just housing environments. One could experiment individually with new building materials, or collectively within different linked groups on a bigger project, as long as the tools, opinions, and intermediate results were relayed back. So we can ask ourselves, what specifically can we as architects, planners, and builders learn from these building sites? And Jacomien Kistemaker had a beautiful explanation. Jacomien Kustemaker was the chairwoman of the foundation Vrouw Bouw Wonen. Had a great explanation of bouwen is wonen and wonen is bouwen. So building is dwelling and dwelling is building, which serves as an umbrella for all three building perspectives, connecting them to the ideas of early women's housing movement via a vision of permanent transforming, building as a continuous act of making and unmaking itself. She says, and here's a full block quote, building from the inspiration that an empty space evoked and constructing what you needed while living there. This stood in stark contrast to the pre-programmed housing and construction models of, for instance, new apartment blocks, where you needed a power drill just to hammer a nail into the wall. These ideas did, however, continue to resonate, both in how we, so the foundation and the members, lived in our own spaces, and in the notions now gradually emerging among women in squats and self-built projects. So to illustrate the tools of the eco-feminist, socialist feminist, and anarcho-feminist building sites, I have a couple examples. So to the first, the eco-feminist building site. So Pauline and I found the following, the first case study of the igloo, designed and built by the artist Dia Loze in the experimental garden Viba, as she wished to study this typology through practice and to learn from more than human architecture, such as beaver dams. Living with and on the land, understanding material principles and self-sustenance were important acts of self-determination. And the design sought to incorporate indigenous knowledge and materials with a DIY mentality, and she explicitly said that. Furthermore, the design was purposefully kept low-tech to apply materials that wouldn't need heavy or complex materials, only simple tools, and even the bodies of builders. The extensive preparation of the ground included the planting and collective making of construction materials, willow and loam, where hands, feet, and mind worked in unison, and that you can see on the bottom right with a group of people. The attendance to the site contracted and expanded as needed, and it reconciled with the idea that the structure was impermanent and would dissolve back into the soil. At the same time, the Dutch Vrouw Bouw Wonen network realized that they had much to learn regarding the crossover between ecological and feminist principles, and chose to look towards German female architects and West German building projects. So this is specifically something that I just want to mention very briefly, the Kruidsberg project. Really interesting because it merges eco-feminist perspectives with also socialist tenets of equal labor and the provision of labor specifically for migrant Turkish women. So then, into the socialist feminist building site. In the 1985 edition of the Vrouw Bouw Wonen krant, Vrouw Bouwen Utrecht, which is one of the local branches of Vrouw Bouw Wonen, announced that they intended to set up a renovation project in which the entire process would be carried out by women. Ultimately, the project was called Lange Nieuwstraat. Central to this plan was a leerlingenbouwplaats, which is a female student building site, where 10 female builders would be employed for the duration of the project. The approach was emancipatory. By creating opportunities for women to learn and improve their professional building skills, they would at the same time contribute to job creation and financial position. Particularly important in the crisis-ridden 1980s, when full-time employment was scarce in the Netherlands, while also providing housing for women. That was also really important. As the announcement stated, the aim was to realize a product in which all participants recognize themselves: female architects, women builders, and users. Over the course of 2 years, they updated on their progress regularly, and in these news articles divulged their tools. Even though architect and co-initiator Jeanne van Brey refuses to call the project feminist, she does wonder how the project could enable better housing and working conditions for women, and for men, and for children. They try to navigate the building and design process with an active committee of women. Some of them intended to be the future residents. This, in hindsight, failed due to the financial implications of the building. They had to have a contractor and they weren't aligned in the process. Their vision of housing, which negated traditional hierarchies, was subject to a financially informed project management. And then lastly, there is the anarcho-feminist building site. So there were other cases that bridged horizontal pedagogy with activism, mutual aid, and voluntary association. In the leesbundel Vrouw Bouw Woon of 1983, the initiative Tangeland, which you see here in the very nice drawing over there, was explained. A group that wanted, explained as, a group that wanted to found a national educational center for women in technical professions, tutored by women in practice and advocating for self-directed and collective learning spaces. Women were made able to apply for technical jobs, and naturally their skill sets needed to be improved. Providing safe, women-friendly building sites and educational environments, they set out to tackle the fraught realities of the building site, a space rife with sexist discrimination and oppressive hierarchies. So to quote their statement, Tangeland is meant to serve as an alternative to existing vocational programs. In the regular programs, students are confronted not only with the curriculum itself, but also with a range of unpleasant side effects. It is often precisely these side effects that make it impossible to complete the program successfully. To mention a few of these issues: sexist behavior from fellow students, sexist and often also racist behavior from instructors, and a constant power struggle with the established structure. So they sought out to establish horizontal education. So considering these examples, I would already like to conclude by emphasizing that we should continue to look back at the building experiments of Vrouw Bouw Wonen for inspiration in our contemporary context on how, with whom, and what we build. We took a look at 3 types of building perspectives or building sites: the eco-feminist material experiments with land and soil on the building sites, the socialist feminist emancipatory building sites of leerlingenbouwplaatsen, and the anarcho-feminist self-organized collectives and pedagogical centers. They explored the ways which different actors could collaborate on the site, irrespective of official titles, the practice of a philosophy of building as a continuous act of design and construction, and they advocated for the exploration of a new, more just material culture. These testing grounds anticipated the evolution of many questions that still challenge us today, like the previous presentations this evening also have shown. And they also explored building sites as an alternative learning and material environment, where housing as a transformative practice could be practiced, not in a hierarchical way, nor by reducing political thought to top-down solutions, but through hands-on participatory engagement. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Maybe just stay here, and then I would like to ask Katie and Mari and Paulien as well to the front and give some space for a couple of questions before we go back to the bar. Yeah, sure.
it's a very pedantic question, and I'm sorry for that. But then it's because we're architectural historians, so we are sometimes pedantic. But I'm making it because it seems that some things are depending on it. Because it was mentioned twice that in the analysis of Sergio Ferro, he said that medieval cathedrals had no architects. And that is not true. They did have architects who they are known, their names are known. They were called master builders, and they traveled around Europe, and that's why you can find the same floor plans sometimes in France as you could in England. It seems to me that the fact that this is an idea that came up in the kind of, the time that the medieval times were sort of romanticized in the 19th century, because it seemed that that the whole position of the architect as someone who stands outside of the building site and makes drawings, which are then built, that this is somehow, that this is directly linked to a certain historic period of the division of labor. And so that before capitalism, there could be no architects because you didn't have that division of labor. But I'm thinking that since we have a room full, with a lot of architects here, is that not a form of masochism that the architectural profession is putting upon itself by basically saying that the whole basis of the profession, meaning from, amongst other things, an artistic inspiration, making a drawing of a huge building that is then built by other people, that is somehow wrong, that is somehow capitalist, that is somehow inauthentic, anti-emancipatory, etc. So I'm wondering that I agree. I mean, the practice of Sergio Ferro, the practical implications of somebody like Sergio Ferro, I think it's amazing, it's beautiful, but it's the theoretical implications of it that say that architecture as a drawing art is wrong. Is that not a shame in a way that you are putting yourself in that position?
Who wants to respond? Or say something about it? Any thoughts?
I always think, one of the things in the first text of Ferro's that we translated, which was a talk he would have given at a conference in Newcastle in 2014, he says, that, it's unbearable for architects. It's unbearable for him to think in this way. And he says, I think somewhere, architects hate me. So it's a very unpalatable. I think we often talked in the project as well about. I just want to be precise about what Ferro says about the Gothic period, and he's very careful of talking about different stages in the sort of cathedral building. Without kind of going through all the kind of examples, he is careful about that. So he has these kind of proto-architects that appear in later building sites. And I think Mari also said that it's not drawing is not per se the problem, but we do need to think about what we're doing is at the same time we need to think about those practices and really what they're doing. And I suppose for me, when it came to specification and Sergio's ideas, I couldn't explain that difference really before I started to understand what he was talking about. So it seems to have the most incredible explanatory power, which I don't think you have to take then that we have to do away with drawings, but maybe we need to be aware of the other things that those drawings or specifications and the way that we produce architecture? What else are they producing? I don't know if Mari wants to say more.
Just that, as I explained from the practice of Arquitetura Nova, he's not at all saying that architects should stay away from drawing, and that he really relates the métier of the architect with the drawing. It's just what kind of drawing are we producing, and what are these drawings transmitting? Are they and then this is the idea, are they transmitting like a dialogical process between your vision and who is building it, or are they just giving orders? So I think it's not about the creativity that it involves in the job. It's not about the intentions. I think most of the architects have all of that, but then it's how those are being translated in the traditional practice. And if we don't get like awareness, I know it's quite devastating. Like Katie said, sometimes some architects in Brazil really like dread the critique that he's making. But then at the same time, if you're not aware of it, then like we will keep trying the same things with the same end result, and we'll keep trying different approaches, but ending up with the same problem. So I feel it's important that we identify the problem, that we can think through new solutions. And I apology, but I have a train to take back to Brussels. So I would like to thank everybody. And then Paulien has my contact. If there's any questions, it was really, really great to be here tonight. Thank you.
Thank you for being here. Yeah. Okay, Paulien, come stand here. You're so in the corner. Any other questions? Comments? Yes.
I have a question. It's sort of mostly to Katie, but everybody else can also answer it, of course. Yeah, because so first you said you were curious about other situations in which sort of specification works differently. And I thought of this architecture office from Ecuador that's called Al Borde. And they have this practice that they call sort of open design. So they only detail the building to a certain extent, understanding that a lot will be figured out when you're building it, kind of with the architects, with the people that are building it. At the same time, I think it's a practice that could look similar, but I think is fundamentally different to something you actually criticize in Building Materials, your book, which is this idea of sort of open specification or design intent. You connect these things, and here in the Netherlands, I think they would translate a lot to this role of aesthetic control that the architect takes usually in the construction phase. Yeah, which you could say maybe is similar, but at the same time, I think changes a lot in terms of who is actually building and then who is taking the decisions for how things should be detailed. So first, I was wondering kind of what your position is towards it, or kind of what is this fundamental difference between maybe an idea of sort of like open design, figuring things out together, and allowing sort of a contractor to figure things out. And yeah, kind of the second thing is, how do you, I would also like to know how kind of like you equate maybe this sort of like critique of this position that the architect takes with the this extension of the specification, this over detailing of specification that also kind of removes agency from the building site. So what is the way out? It's not, yeah, that's it.
Maybe a microphone.
Oh, sorry. It's really interesting, the question about the two types. I mean, I mean, one of the things about the specification, I think, is I mean, I think the idea of writing instructions or writing aims, I mean, you know, one of the reasons I was drawn to it was the idea of writing a building or writing building processes is somehow kind of wonderful. I mean, and yet, of course, in standardized building, I mean, that's not, you know, that's not what happens. So, you know, you can fall in love sometimes with these process-based clauses or something. There's something really rich with possibilities, and yet they're you know, they're sort of stamped out because this is a standardized process in the main. So I guess I'm in looking at the kind of actual specifications and very carefully and what they're kind of, how they're constructed and so on. Like there's also another thing which opens up, which is just different possible ways of doing it. So I don't think I have like what's the way out kind of an answer. It's really interesting that you point out that there would be different types of open specification. And I mean, I suppose if you look at a performance-based specification that's kind of that big, it's not, I mean, it's not open, but the question is, where is it open? And to me, the question that's important is not, like, people will often say in general, like, well, specifications are getting bigger and bigger and more precise, but you have to ask, what are they precise about? And of course, yeah, I mean, the reason for the open specification today, or the visual intent, is, yeah, there's no, the architect, the designer is having very little say in how, or even what a building will be built from. And there are all kinds of people making lots of money out of that, the contractor, but also the materials manufacturers, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So, yeah, but I think it's a really important point that you're making, that about this kind of, that being open might mean many different things, and perhaps that goes back to this point earlier as well. I'm not in terms of, I mean, in more detail in the book, the sort of the next big shift is the shift to performance specification. So we're really in a world that's completely different to the one from the sort of the 18th century, and it's much more complex to understand. And I don't really know what the performance specification says about building work on site. I'm not sure if it does. It seems to say do different things. Sorry, it's a bit of a rambling answer, sorry, to a very complicated question. More later.
Well, thank you. Maybe one or two, yeah, there's one there, and then we do one more, and then we have drinks.
Thanks so much. This question is going to be completely out of the architecture field, because that's not my field, but the participatory part is what I'm interested in. And so when we're talking about the alternative construction side, and this is more for you, Paulien, and the inclusion of the participatory process for people that are involved in the building site, do you consider also the involvement of the participatory process to have outsiders, like citizens that are close to the building site, or any? Is that something that has been considered? If so, how would that look like? And this question is purely because currently where I'm living, there's like about 3 building sites around me, and I feel quite attached to it. You know, curious of what's happening and what's going on there. But yet again, the fences are also there for me, not just for the people working. The fences also stop me from knowing what's happening. Am I even allowed to be curious about it? I'm asking myself. And yeah, so I just thought, since we're talking about levels of participation of others in processes, what is the role of a person outside completely?
Yeah, I think no rule in this, I guess, but examples. And I think one beautiful example is, for example, what Superuse did, I think, but maybe Floris can correct me. For example, Bosgaard is a project where, which is built, making use of reused materials, and also the future people who gonna rent the house, so not buy but rent it, they transformed it themselves, and I think they also had a system, or I think people, friends, but also people from the neighbor could join. I think, is it right? Yeah, could join the participatory. Yeah, could participate. So yeah.
Thank you. One last question. Yes.
I actually also have a question for Katie. I'm wondering whether you obviously see like a proliferation of clauses with the specifications. Did that also have something to do with the development of law, or like, because often these clauses are tied together with risk and the way that architects or builders need to insulate themselves from risk on the building site?
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, no, I'm not a major expert, but yes, I mean, I suppose, and that first, and in fact, I mean, the kind of popular discourse around this, what I call the trades-based specification, the new one in the late 18th, 19th century, was that it was about eliminating the risk of kind of bad quality, really, like contractors getting away with, you know, poor quality work. So there was definitely that. And then you're absolutely right that the modern specification seems to be all about avoiding anybody asking someone to do something in the specification that then will turn out to have been a bad idea. And yeah, I mean, one of the most interesting conversations I had was with specifications consultants who told me that they had started their practice. They were employed as claims surveyors. So what they would do if a contractor was losing money on a big job, they were talking about Hong Kong, Shanghai Bank, if contractors losing money on a job, then they will go through all the documentation and try to find out inconsistencies. And it wouldn't matter if that hadn't, you know, been built correctly, but if there were inconsistencies there, then they could make claims and recoup some money for the contractor. And they were so good at this that it was Foster's to start with. They invited them to start writing their specifications. So, and through this, we were talking before about whether you have access, when you're doing research, what you get access to. I think, yeah, with Alina, we were talking about the fact that she couldn't get onto building sites to film, for example. And I found, I mean, as soon as you went to a big practice and asked them for a copy of their specification, there's no way you were going to get that. And they were worried that's what would, you know, that's what would happen. So, yes, I mean, this sort of protection role of it is exceedingly important. Yeah.
Well, thank you all so much. Thank you, Katie. Thank you, Setareh, from Maria as well, and thank you, Paulien, for bringing this together. Really hope to see you on the next evening on the 4th of November. And yeah, stick around for a drink at the bar. Thanks. Sorry?
I just wanted to say
that one announcement.
I just wanted to say one plug. First of all, I have some books about Lele, that's 2 plugs. But the second is that we've been running, Mari and I and various people, a monthly online group where we talk about women and construction. And anybody who'd be interested to join, we'll just pop you on the date. The next one's on Thursday, so yeah, we'd love to see you.
Maybe if you're interested in this, send an email to the school and then we connect you. Yeah? Yeah. Okay. Thank you.